Officially, it was named Johnson's Cave, but no one in the town used that title. No, we all just called it the Labyrinth. Our main tourist attraction. It was a really unique feature side by side. The entrance and the exit sat separated only by a 4-foot wall of limestone. But to get from one end to the other, you had to pass through more than a mile of maze-like passages behind them. Most paths led to a dead end, but there was exactly one route, one perfect sequence of turns you could take that would lead you out. Signs placed back in the 70s could be used for hints to help you find your way. But the challenge was to make it through without using any of those or one of the maps provided at the trailhead. Because even for those who had completed it successfully dozens of times, it could be disorienting. Dim lighting installed in the 80s helped somewhat considering, as it wasn't very powerful, it was still a vast improvement over the pitch black of an unlit subterranean pit. Regardless of the measures they took to make it easier, however, there was just a certain atmosphere within. Many found it difficult to remember why they entered in the first place, let alone the intricate series of operations required to negotiate to the exit. Despite the maps and signage, park rangers still had to enter at least once a week to recover someone who'd become hopelessly lost. Yet some of them claimed their misdirection arose differently than simply taking a few wrong turns. Some claimed they'd been following a voice, one offering to show them the way, one that was always just in the next room. Local lore stressed to never explore the maze alone. In the early 90s, staff was only on site during the day, and used a paper tracking system to document who was in the cave at any given time. Prospective spelunkers needed to register with them on the way in and on the way out, but it was all done by hand. And for larger groups, they usually only made one person sign in and report their party size before entering. Surprisingly, though it sounds shoddy by today's standards, it had worked without major issue for years. The rangers even felt confident enough in it that after closing, they'd shut the lights off within to conserve energy and minimize the impact on the cave ecosystem. But their system had a serious flaw. It relied on the honesty of people. The tales shared around campfires told of at least 3 cavers before my time who'd entered the labyrinth and never left again. And I was 4 years old in 1995 when it claimed the 4th. There was a passageway in the deepest chamber of the main maze that was closed to the general public. Locked behind a gate, the section beyond was only accessible to park staff, though no one had entered it in nearly 10 years by that summer. Not since victim number 3 was rumored to have disappeared within its tunnels. Stories varied as to why it was restricted in the first place. Some alleged it was littered with pockets of toxic gas. Others insisted it was due to sheer drops into bottomless chasms. A few purported the forbidden caverns were inhabited by monstrous, violent cryptids of a kind. But when you asked someone that had actually gone through the gate, they'd just say the area didn't seem right. The lighting didn't extend into those tunnels, and they stated it always felt like something was watching them from the blackness. Something they were never quite quick enough to spot with their headlamps, and there existed no reliable map to follow. Sure, there had been efforts to plot the region, but those that had attempted would swear it was impossible because it changes. It was this area that generated the fear of exploring the cave solo. Whatever dangers lie within it, the accounts of the missing spelunkers shared 2 consistencies. All 3 cavers had been exploring beyond the gate, and all 3 had been alone when they vanished. Yet their bodies were never recovered. No one could be sure that they'd actually perished inside. However, when 12-year-old Christopher Shields lost his life, speculation grew that they'd met a similar fate. Chris was not a popular boy, more interested in his studies than athletics or social endeavors. The classic teacher's pet had the unfortunate fate of attending grade school in the early 90s, when being a nerd made you an immediate target. And as was the case with many 90s nerds, he became the victim of a prank gone horribly wrong. When the cool boys in his class invited Chris to hang out, he reportedly told his mother how excited he was to finally have friends, his only emotion when they led him into the labyrinth being the joy of acceptance. However, unbeknownst to Chris, The other boys gave the Rangers the wrong count for their group. And when the rest of the party emerged hours later without him, park staff was none the wiser. During their subsequent trials, the boys confessed that one by one, they'd peeled away from Chris until he was left all alone in the maze. Never having entered it before, Chris was unaware of the signs he could use to find his way, and they hadn't bothered to show them to him before he was abandoned. Worse still, they'd said that it was a short trail, and that the cave was well lit enough that he wouldn't need a flashlight. He brought no food or water with him, nor warm clothing or medical supplies. When the Rangers shut the lights off at closing, Chris was still inside with no provisions, plunged instantly into the pitch black. And if he yelled for help, no one heard him. The following morning, Mr. and Mrs. Shields waited for hours for a son that would never return. Chris having informed them that there was to be a sleepover after the hike, his first one ever. Each of the boys that took him into the labyrinth would later testify that they never intended for Chris to spend a full night in the cave. They thought at least that he'd be able to solve it before sunset. They were stupid. Chris was supposed to be home by 10 a.m. the following morning, and by noon, the Shields were beginning to worry. They started making calls to other parents, and as word spread quickly through our small town of the missing boy, it only took a few hours before the deceit was exposed. One of the conspirators, fearing stronger reprisal if Chris was gravely injured or worse than what would already be coming their way for the little joke they'd played, fessed up to the whole thing. By 2 p.m., a search party was combing every inch of Johnson's cave, at least every inch of the well-mapped public area, and, dividing into teams, by 6 p.m., most of the maze had already been searched. There was no sign of Chris, but as dusk crept in on the outside, Mrs. Shields claimed she heard his voice. She swears, even to this day, that it was him. What mother wouldn't recognize her son calling to her for help? Yet, as she was the only one that did, skeptics feel maybe it was her desperate mind playing tricks on her. However, she followed whatever it was to the entrance of the restricted area and demanded that they unlock the gate to search beyond it. "He's just through there, don't you hear him?" she wailed. Though it seemed impossible, the door was intact and locked properly when park staff inspected it, and Chris neither had a key nor the tools or experience anyone was aware of that would have allowed him to pick his way through it. But they could not deny the hysterical mother, and as they were confident by that time that Chris wasn't anywhere else within the cave, they relented. Some men experienced with the typically prohibited tunnels entered, and they were astonished to discover that Mrs. Shields was right. A few hundred yards past the gate, they found her son's lifeless body, a scream still frozen on his face. She cursed the men who'd found him for not acting faster, howling through anguished tears that she'd heard him alive just 30 minutes before the body was located. No amount of explaining to her that it was not possible that he'd been calling to her assuaged her fury, even when they told her, after they'd examined his corpse, that Chris had died at least 16 hours earlier. No one was ever formally charged in his death. It was ruled a tragic accident, as there was no evidence to say otherwise. The autopsy found no signs of foul play, but then again, it found no signs of what had killed him at all. All they were able to confirm is that at some point, his heart stopped beating. The boys that played the prank were initially suspected of having murdered Chris and hidden his body where it was found, but their parents were able to provide alibis for them. The sleepover was real, and the boys were all in attendance at the time of Chris's passing. The leading theory then became that someone else had taken Chris beyond the gate and stolen his life from him. Someone else that had maybe stumbled upon him all alone and saw an opportunity for nefarious a deed. But no one came forward, and no new evidence surfaced. The pranksters were sentenced to a bit of community service, and the case went cold. After Chris's death, it was decided that Johnson's cave needed some serious safety improvements if it was to remain open to the public, so it was closed for a short period. The gate was removed from the entrance to the restricted area and replaced with 3 feet of solid concrete, and they installed new blockades and cameras at the main entrance and exit. Now, anybody that wanted to tour the labyrinth would have to pass through full-height turnstiles manned by park staff when entering and leaving ensuring an accurate count of each person within. Any discrepancies could be verified by the cameras, and they guaranteed the public of its robustness, even going so far as to hire a night shift guard to prevent anyone from sneaking in after hours. It was a fairly basic system, but much improved from the old hand count honor system that was used before. On each of the turnstiles, there was a button both inside and outside that would unlock them to rotate either to let someone in or let someone out, allowing people who wanted to give up on making it all the way through the ability to return to the entrance and leave that way, or for cavers who wanted an additional challenge to work the maze backwards by starting at the exit. As hikers came and went through either gate, the system would calculate the total number of people inside, as well as the total number of people who entered for the day. Simple. Foolproof. When they reopened, they believed they'd made it impossible to have a repeat of the Christopher Shields tragedy. But they were wrong. When I was 14, the cave claimed my best friend Brandon Collins, and it tried to take me too. To say Brandon was obsessed with the labyrinth would be an understatement. By the summer of 2005, he'd already completed it successfully over 40 times. His parents had given him an unlimited pass for his 14th birthday, along with the freedom to go exploring on his own. And, as the park in which Johnson's Cave resides was between his house and our school, and he walked past it every day on his way home from classes. In the first 6 months he had the pass, he explored the maze multiple times a week, pestering me non-stop to be his companion. Brandon and I had been best friends since the first grade, as I was an only child. He was the closest thing I had to a brother. And though it cost me $3 every time I capitulated, I navigated the cave with him on several occasions just to support his passion. Though, truthfully, I didn't quite understand his fixation, as, to me, it was just another hike. Yet to Brandon, its passageways were akin to holy ground. He used to always say that he felt a sort of special connection with the place. Fascinated by it, he'd tell anyone that would listen that it wasn't just a hole in a hill. It was alive. And he was not to be deterred from trying to drag me along with him every time that he went, convinced that one day I would learn to revere it too. Regardless of my inability to understand its magnificence in the same way, I had to admit that there was something, if not inherently impressive, at least curiously strange about it. There was the mystery of Christopher Shields to consider, and the odd phenomena of forgetfulness within. Brandon told me that even no matter how many times he made the attempt, he still had difficulty finding the way out. That was what he loved the most about it, the never-ending battle hymn versus the earth itself, a true test of determination and mental fortitude. He was determined to unlock all of its mysteries. I remember well my first venture into the labyrinth with him. Before the inaugural trip, Brandon provided me with a map of the full system, made me study the exact route through until I had it memorized and could recite every turn back to him perfectly. And once we were inside, I understood why. When we reached the first fork, he asked me, left or right? Annoyed that he was already quizzing me, I responded with a confident, left. Are you sure? He posed with a wry smile. Yeah, I'm positive, dude. It's the first fork, pretty hard to forget. I incredulously replied. Okay then, let's try that way, he said, as he started down the corridor. But 5 minutes later, the tunnel we were marching down came to an abrupt end. Staring at the solid wall in front of me, I was baffled by how I'd managed to get the very first turn wrong. Seeing my dumbfounded expression, Brandon started laughing, before simply stating, don't worry, happens to everyone in here. I've ended up exactly where you're standing more times than I can count. Returning to where path had originally branched off, I knew now that we were supposed to head down the opposite trail from the one that I'd selected. But looking at the two options before me, I found that I couldn't remember which one went back to the entrance and which one led deeper into the cave. And two, chuckling more at my confusion, Brandon told me to stand perfectly still with my back to the opening we'd just come through. while he reached for a small sign next to the gap on the right-hand side. He then flipped a little metal latch in the center of it and pulled down a small wooden flap to reveal the words, "To entrance," hidden behind it. Imitating our insufferably coddling geography teacher, Mrs. Wilkes, he inquired in a sickeningly sweet, high-pitched squeal, "All right, so now, if your back is to the tunnel we just came from, and that one leads to a dead end, and the sign says this way goes back to the entrance, which way do we need to go to move forward?" "That way, asshole," I snapped, pointing to the only option that remained. He responded with mockingly enthusiastic applause, and I flipped him off before continuing. And the remainder of the journey was no better. We got lost at least 10 different times. Brandon was letting me navigate, and no matter how hard I tried, I might as well have been flipping a coin for how accurately I recalled the route. I'd thought the signage would be a bit more helpful as well. Brandon had made it sound like everything was so well marked that even an unsupervised child could easily find their way. But that wasn't really the case. Not every tunnel had a sign, forcing you to really focus to make sure that you didn't forget which of the unmarked paths you'd already tried. And even the tunnels that did only had hints of "to entrance," "to exit," or a large X to indicate a branch that led nowhere, further complicated by the fact that it was inconsistent from room to room. Some areas were labeled with the way forward, others the way back. It was a game, admittedly, though wildly frustrating at times. It was an intriguing experience. There was something about the place, a quietness you couldn't experience in the outside world. When we paused for a minute in one of the larger rooms to have a bit of water, and I sat up against the rock wall, I got the sensation of wanting to stay in that spot indefinitely, a feeling of peace dripping down my spine, calmness, stillness. Brandon had to snap me out of somewhat of a trance to get me moving again. I reluctantly carried on, and, though it took us nearly 3 times as long as it would have for Brandon to do it alone, eventually we found our way to the exit. When we finally made it, I actually did feel a strong sense of accomplishment, a booming pride at having emerged victorious over the ancient passageways. But once was enough for me. Returning home from the endeavor, I found myself more exhausted than I'd ever been. Not just from the physical exertion of traipsing around underground for hours, but mentally, I'd been taxed more than any exam or homework assignment had ever pushed me. However, Brandon was relentless, and every few weeks I couldn't take his badgering anymore, and agreed to go again. And it was on our 4th adventure that he said something that took my feelings towards his devotion to the cave from polite annoyance to that of deep concern. We had been hiking for several hours. Brandon was navigating, and I was beginning to get the sense that he wasn't trying to find the exit quickly. In fact, I was suspicious that we were entering areas that I'd never been to before, although it was difficult to tell if that was just due to the effect the labyrinth had on spelunkers. But I became convinced something was wrong when we arrived at a room that had no exits, and Brandon seemed extremely pleased about it. "Found it!" he exclaimed, as he set his pack down in the center of the cavern. "Found what?" I asked, initially not seeing anything about the space warranting his excitement. To my observation, we were once again lost, and it was going to take significant backtracking to get back onto the right path. "This." He moved towards the far wall, and there I noticed was a strange patch in the rock face, a slab of gray amidst the reds and browns. Concrete. Reaching forward, he ran his fingers curiously over the rock face next to it, gingerly probing along the surface, almost like he was searching for a weakness of some kind. "Do you feel it?" he asked me in a low whisper, as if not wanting to disturb an unseen occupant in the room with us. Unease was the only sensation I was experiencing at the time. That and a strong urge to pull him away from the wall and sprint out of there. Without waiting for me to answer, he continued, "It's like there's something behind here. Something pulling me towards it. I can't always find this place. I think they leave it off the maps. Even when I come into the cave specifically searching for it, most of the time I just end up at the exit. But sometimes, if I listen closely, I hear something. A faint voice, always just in the next room. If I follow it, it leads me here. He never turned while he was speaking. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. For a moment I thought he was maybe messing with me, trying to give me a scare, but it was like he had forgotten I was even there. His behavior sent a chill through me. Reflexively, I dropped my voice to match his as I anxiously approached him from behind. "Hey, Brandon, I think we should get out of here," I begged, still staring straight at the wall. Caressing the sealed surface, he replied, "Yeah, you're right. We should go. It's not time. Need to come at night. It doesn't like the light." He removed his hand and stepped back. I jumped a foot in the air when he suddenly returned to his normal speaking volume to ask me, "Dude, what are you doing?" In reference to me being mere inches behind him when he spun and nearly crashed into me. Never mind, can we go?" I replied. "Yay, all right, let's get moving," he said as he picked up his pack from the floor. We made it out without further incident, but Brandon wasn't as thrilled as he normally was when we exited, clicking his way through the turnstile and signing out with the ranger without any of the usual fanfare. When I asked if he was okay, he told me that he was just tired, but I could tell he was lying to me. "Need to come at night." The words kept playing over in my head. I kept thinking of Christopher Shields trapped in the dark. Had he heard someone guiding him to that part of the cave too? Had he felt the pull that Brandon described? I tried to talk to him about what had happened in the hidden chamber, but he kept brushing it off, pretending like nothing abnormal occurred in there, which I thought was fair. Yes, he'd said some creepy things, and yes, the room had made me uneasy. But I reminded myself that Brandon had been spending a lot of time alone in a cave. It was possible he was letting Chris's story seep into his mind a bit too much. And he was starting to hear things amidst the silence and the solitude. I told myself not to worry, even if Brandon wanted to. There was no way he could enter the labyrinth at night. And if he did somehow make it past the guard and the cameras, the restricted area of the cave was behind a 3-foot wall of concrete. The worst that would happen would be he'd have to sleep on a rock floor in a cold, dark room until rangers eventually went in and dragged him out in the morning. But I still didn't think it was healthy for him to keep spending so much time in there. I used some of the tenacity techniques he'd pulled on me to force him to come and play basketball or go fishing instead of running the maze for the 50th time. And I thought he was starting to come around. By the middle of August, it had been 3 weeks since he'd even asked me to come on a hike with him. Everything seemed to be trending in the right direction, until the evening of August 17th, 2005. Brandon never came home from school. It wasn't completely abnormal that summer for him to arrive later. Usually that just meant he was either with me or in the cave. At the time, it was still fairly rare for kids our age to have cell phones, so the standing rule at the Collins household was just that he needed to be home by 7 p.m., or have found a way to contact them to let them know it would be later. It was 9 p.m. when the phone rang in my parents' house. I remember them waking me up that night. I'd gone to play basketball after school with a group of guys from our class, and had invited Brandon to come along with us. But he said he wasn't feeling well, and was just going to walk straight home. Not thinking much of it, as he really did look pale that afternoon, I bade him to feel better, and went off to the courts. Exhausted from the game, I'd fallen asleep early and vividly recall being shook from a deep slumber by my distressed parents. When they asked if I knew why Brandon hadn't come home that evening, or where he might be, the words formed in my mind without me even having to think on them. The labyrinth. I told them about my last conversation with him, that he'd told me he was going home, but that if he hadn't arrived there, then most likely he was in the maze. But my parents informed me that the Collinses had already called the park. The guard on duty verified that Brandon's name was not on the list of registered hikers for the day, and that the count of people remaining in the cave stood at a firm 0 as recorded by the system. Moreover, the turnstiles were set to alarm if they rotated after closing, and neither the one at the entrance or exit had tripped. In their minds, he couldn't be there. Yet in my mind, it was the only place that he could be. Brandon was smart, and he was at that park so often that if there was a weakness to exploit in their security, I was sure he would have found it. I tried to convince my parents that they should tell the Collins that if they were going to search for him, they should start at the cave despite the impossibility of him being there. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. They said I should go back to sleep and that the adults were going to figure out what to do. The police were going to get involved and that they'd likely find him in the next few hours. I was assured that before I woke up, he'd be back home with his parents. However, they didn't account for me not giving a shit about anything they'd just said. True, I had convinced myself already that there were no real threats to be had in the labyrinth after dark, and it was his own damn fault for sneaking in there. But I had a gut feeling that he was in danger, that every minute he continued to spend in there was a threat to his mortality. Acting on pure instinct, as soon as my parents left my room, I grabbed a flashlight from the closet and climbed out the window. It was a cool summer evening. The damp air smelled of impending rain. Hopping the back fence, I took a shortcut through the woods, picking my way through the trees as swiftly as my newly awakened legs would allow. And along the way, I tried to imagine how he might have done it. The turnstiles they installed blocked both the entrance and exit to the degree that you could not get into, or out of, either opening without passing through them. Also, the ranger's booth sat in between the two and was staffed full-time. The way the surrounding rocks naturally funneled visitors to the cave, it was impossible to even get to the barricades without passing within a few feet of it. As I considered how Brandon had succeeded in cheating security, I began to ponder how the hell I was going to do it myself. With the night guard in the booth, there was no way I was going to be able to sneak by without him seeing me. Even if I could, I'd trigger the alarm the instant I spun the turnstile to enter. With little time to formulate a solid or even halfway intelligent plan, I opted to go with the first strategy that came to mind. Brute force. When I arrived at the mouth of the valley that fed its way down to the cave, I paused for a brief moment to collect myself, and then I charged. Sprinting as quickly as I could, I ran full speed towards the entrance, ignoring the shouts that I started to hear as I approached. My plan was simple. The guard would take a few seconds to get out of the booth once he noticed me. If I could put enough distance between us, I was confident that once we were both inside the maze, I could lose him in the branching passages. Right, 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 I chanted it as I approached the turnstile, trying to force my brain to remember the direction I'd need to go at the first fork, knowing from prior experience that as soon as I crossed over the boundary into the earth, I might forget. Arriving at the gate, I slammed my hand into the button to unlock the rotating barrier and pushed my way through. And when I did, a blaring siren began to pierce my ears, drowning out the yells of the man chasing me. Undaunted, I picked my pace back up, refusing to look behind to see if I was about to be imminently captured, focused solely on my task. Right, no, left, wait, no, right, no, left, shit. Mere feet beyond the barricade, and I was already forgetting which direction I needed to go, aware that if I chose incorrectly, I'd find myself at a dead end, and likely be caught before I even had a chance to begin my search for Brandon. Moving as quickly as I dared into the deepening blackness, I appreciated for the first time the true meaning of the word dark. The faint lights lining the walls had always been illuminated in my prior delves with Brandon now. With their bulbs devoid of power, I realized that beyond the beam of my flashlight, my eyes could perceive nothing. The rangers would still shut them off at night, but I had assumed that the guard would switch them on before coming after me. In his haste to pursue, it appeared he'd forgotten. I wasn't sure if this was better or worse for me. It would make it more difficult for me to navigate the tunnels, but it would also likely make it more difficult for him to catch up to me. Better or worse didn't matter much, though. I couldn't change the situation. Pressing onward was my only option if I wanted to find my friend, and after several minutes of careful jogging, I managed to make it to the first fork with enough of a lead on the guard that when I stopped and hazarded a glance back down the path I'd come from, I couldn't see his light behind me, nor I found could I hear his shouts or footsteps, nor any sounds at all, actually. I had been so caught up in what I was doing that I hadn't noticed the bleats of the alarm fade out. It had been ear-splittingly loud when it went off, and I was only a few hundred yards away from it. I thought I should at least still hear some remnant of its horns, but I found silence. Left or right, left or right. I posed the question to myself as I alternately hovered my light over the openings that split either side of the room. Then suddenly, out of deafening quiet, a whisper met my ears. "Matt!" I'm sure it would have triggered a survival instinct to flee if my adrenaline hadn't already been so high. But I was on a mission, and the voice calling my name sounded familiar. "Brandon?" I responded as calmly as possible, a small feeling of relief breaking through that I might have found him already. "This way," it replied. "Which way? Where are you?" I panned my flashlight to the right-hand tunnel where the barely perceptible words seemed to be echoing from. "Down here," it answered from just beyond my beam of light. Growing annoyed that he was hiding from me, I snapped back. "Dude, quit screwing around and get out here. Let's just turn ourselves into the guard and go home." "No. You follow, I will show the way," came the cryptic response. A light began to bob along the walls from behind me. I had little time to make a decision. "Hurry, he is coming," the voice encouraged me. I wasn't sure why he was refusing to come with me, but I reasoned that he might be trying to prevent my getting caught to keep me out of trouble. With the window to choose rapidly closing, and struggling to think clearly, I trepidatiously turned to the path on the right, and marched forward, hoping I would find Brandon shortly ahead. I was frustrated when I made it to the next fork, still without him appearing. "This way," the voice came from the left-hand branch. I opened my mouth to ask why he hadn't emerged yet, but it cut me off. "Follow," it demanded. Deeper I continued into the maze, obeying the voice's instructions at every junction. After the fifth turn, I was no longer worried about the guard finding me, positive that at some point, our paths had diverged, and I was well beyond his reach. However, I was growing worried about where I was being led. It was Brandon. I could swear it was Brandon. I'd known him for 7 years. We'd grown up together. I was sure it was his voice. Yet there was something off about it. A gravelly grate underneath the normal, snarky pitch. And why hadn't he shown his face? Why did he continue to stay just out of view? I began to think of the stories of Christopher Shields, but those were just stories. After what felt like hours, and countless twists through narrow passageways, I reached a room with only one exit opposite the corridor I'd just entered it from. "Stop," the voice directed from the tunnel ahead. "Why? Where am I?" I inquired. "Almost there," it replied. "Turn it off." "What?" was all I could muster in my confusion. "The light so bright," it hissed. The flashlight was the only thing keeping me out of a complete panic at that point. The little bit of light it provided gave me a small sense of security. "No, are you crazy? I can barely see as it is," I pleaded. It switched from commanding to a soft appeal. "For me, Matt. Turn it off. I will meet you then." For the first time since I'd entered, I detected a hint of movement from the opening in front of me. He was close. I wanted to get to him. It was the entire reason for me being there in the first place. But I wasn't inclined to delete my only source of comfort so easily. Moving forward, I reached the entrance to the channel before me without meeting its request, when it insisted, more forcefully. "No light, it hurts." I could not see the end of the path past a small curve in the tunnel, but it appeared I'd be able to blindly navigate it if I ran my hand along the wall. Considering that Brandon had been in the cave for hours, I thought that maybe his eyes were so sensitive that even my weak torch was searing them. I didn't want to hurt him. Apprehensively, I clicked the flashlight off and plunged myself into pitch black. "Good, follow." Without a visual reference, I kept the fingertips from my right hand on the rock surface while placing the flashlight in my back pocket. Then, putting my left hand out in front of me to avoid crashing into something face first, I cautiously tiptoed onward. Eventually, after what felt like ages, I felt the corridor open up into a larger space. Yes, good. This way, come this way. Nearly there, come to me. The voice was leading me across an open cavern wildly. I flailed my arms around, waiting to connect with flesh, praying I'd see Brandon soon. But it was only guiding me to another passageway. When my hands finally collided with a hard surface, I discerned a slender crack in the rock, just wide enough that I would be able to squeeze my body into it. Come through. Join us. Us? I yelped. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Brandon's voice had mixed with that of others I didn't recognize, the grating timbre now impossible to ignore. I backed away from the wall and reached for the flashlight in my pocket, pointing it out in front of me. I snapped it on to find the concrete wall of the sealed chamber, and next to it, where there should have been nothing but solid rock, there was a portal, a hole where one shouldn't be. I shone my light down the impossible passageway and it landed on a figure at the other end. It remained for only a second, the briefest instant, but I couldn't mistake it. Brandon. Or at least, something pretending to be him. It was a convincing impersonation, except for the pupils, which glowed in the light, reflecting like the eyes of a creature from furthest depths of the ocean. And the skin was cracked hard and like stone. Whatever it was let out a feral shriek before disappearing into the blackness behind it. Fear overtook my desire to save my friend. I ran in the opposite direction, terror ripping through my chest, not knowing if that thing would chase me, sprinting back down the tunnel that had brought me within feet of what I was sure would have been my death. I made it back to the preceding room when I was abruptly blinded. The main lights kicked on throughout the cave. I was saved. The guard had decided after 30 minutes of searching for me in the dark that it would be best to call for backup, and it took him nearly another hour to find his way back to entrance. When he did finally make it back to his booth, he called the police and, while he waited for them to arrive, contacted Brandon's parents. They'd left him their number in case he saw any sign of their son, and he informed them that he just had a young boy go sprinting past him into the maze. Brandon's parents contacted mine to let them know they were heading to the park and to ask for their help, which is when mine discovered I wasn't in my bed. Now the question became which boy had run through the barrier, or if it was possible that more than one was inside. They did a more thorough check of the records from that day and found a discrepancy in the count. When they added up the total number of hikers who had gone through the turnstiles and the total number of hikers who'd registered to be in the cave, they found the numbers were off by 1. It was human error. When they reviewed the camera feeds from the time the unregistered hiker entered the labyrinth, the ranger on duty was distracted by a young woman who was on her way out. Brandon snuck right by him and passed through the barricade. Then, he simply hit the button on the opposite side and rotated the turnstile as if someone had left, immediately erasing the additional count. Convinced then that both of us were in the cave, they formed teams and began to sweep the tunnels. I had been working my way backwards towards the entrance since the lights came on, trying to put as much distance between myself and us as possible. Eventually, running into a police officer that then stayed with me until I reconnected with my parents. They were furious but thankful that I was unharmed, hugging me harder than ever before. But Brandon's parents were not so lucky. During the search, Mrs. Collins, exactly as Mrs. Shields had 10 years earlier, followed what she swore was her son's voice to the chamber with the sealed passage. Yet when she arrived there, she found nothing but solid walls. The opening I'd seen Brandon through was gone. However, between her adamancy that she could hear Brandon behind the rock and the story that I relayed about witnessing something that looked like him in that area when they could not locate him anywhere else, park officials agreed to break open the wall, speculating that he may have found an undocumented passage that led to the other side. I was not surprised when they found his body within, nor by the expression of horror permanently etched onto his face. By then, I had already formed my own theory of what had happened to Brandon and the others preceding him. Whatever that thing was, if it was part of the cave itself, or some other ancient malevolence that inhabited it, it had taken them all. For the first 3, and likely many more before them, it had only had to wait for lonely, unsuspecting prey to to come to it. But once people stopped venturing into its hunting grounds, it had adapted and began to lure them in instead. As soon as it had decided that it wanted to make them part of us, it was already too late, which is why I was not shocked either when they told me Brandon was already dead when my parents had woken me up that night. Brandon's death was the final nail in the coffin for Johnson's Cave. It was deemed too dangerous for a tourist attraction. Not only did they seal the entrance to the restricted area for a second time, but given they could not locate the secondary path to it that had to exist somewhere, they sealed the main entrance and exit completely as well. No one was supposed to enter it again, but this year the local government voted. They want to reopen the labyrinth in 2025. The town has been suffering economically for a long time, and they want to bring the tourist dollars back. There's even talking of reopening the Forbidden Passage. I went to the meeting to speak against it. I warned them that there is something lurking in the darkness, that it hungered to take more into the depths. Yet I was shouted down, scolded for spreading ghost stories from 20 years ago. Having lost the battle, I advised them, at least, to never shut the lights off. And when I left there, I considered that maybe they were right. After all, I was young, my best friend died. Maybe my mind had fabricated the evil festering below the earth there. So I went back to the labyrinth and approached the entrance where the workers have nearly broken back through the concrete. I stuck my ear up to the wall and I swear I heard it, just as clear as when I was a boy. A gravelly whisper, Brandon's voice layered in with the rest.
Welcome back, Matt. Will you come join us now? Will you come join us now? Will you come join us now?
Wow, that was one haunting descent into the shadows of the labyrinth. A massive thank you to the original author, Duke of Depravity, for crafting such a gripping and chilling tale. Be sure to check out their other terrifying works. Links are in the description. The idea of a malevolent entity lurking in the darkness, claiming its victims one by one, is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. This story makes us question how much of the unknown is truly safe to explore, and are some mysteries better left buried in the dark? If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more like it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more eerie narrations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the labyrinth is home to something supernatural, or is it all just an elaborate legend? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Have a creepy story of your own or a suggestion for my next narration? Drop it in the comments or reach out. Your tale could be featured in an upcoming video. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you soon. Until then, stay safe out there. You never know.